All right, thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everybody. My name is Joel Minton. I run the login.gov program for the GSA and the White House. And we're a platform that's here to basically build a shared service that will allow federal agencies to have a single login for all of their websites and applications and the like. This has been in the works about 2.5 years. It's been tried many times. It's by no means a for sure thing at this point. Like these things have failed in the past, so we're trying as hard as we can to collaborate across all of government, across all of industry. That's why we're here today, to basically build an amazing solution for all Americans. So let's start with what this is about. This presentation is titled Improve Government Services for Citizens. You notice in that title, nowhere does it talk about identity. Nowhere does it talk about login. Like, users don't care about login. They don't care about anything behind login. All they care about is getting the services that they want. Whether that's a government service, whether that's a commercial service, that's what they care about. And so we've tried to be very careful to say, we're going to create a great customer experience while at the same time increase privacy and security. As you see on the right, those three things have to be true to create something that's going to be useful for users. Second, we need to get the user back to the service ASAP. So one of the metrics we look at is how quickly do we get the user back. If they have to go through 10 steps to get something done, it's going to be very difficult for the agency to not lose that user. And the last part is, what is the process that we put in place within our teams that actually allow us to deliver on those outcomes that I have listed on the slide. It's not enough to just say that we're going to do all of this, but we also have to say, we're going to do all of this, and here's how we're going to actually measure it, here's how we're going to deliver it, here's how we're going to make sure that it works for all the users. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about usability. I spoke a little bit earlier this week on how do we partner with industry to make this happen. I'm going to focus just on the usability aspects of it. And as part of that usability, we leverage contractors, we leverage industry, we leverage great government employees. Those are some of the things I talked about on Monday. But I'm going to talk now about what do we do specifically in the login.gov program to enable great services for citizens. So number one, just kind of the boring stuff, like what do you have to do to create a great experience for users, whether this be in industry or government or wherever it might be. First, we work closely with agencies to understand what is different about their users. How are they different than every other user that might come to us? I will tell you, the global entry users that we have using login.gov to log in to get global entry are very different than the USA Jobs users. And we saw that in full force when we implemented USA Jobs. So understanding really well how we partner with agencies to be able to deliver out for their users was really important. Second, how do we make sure that we're laser focused on those user needs and not based on standards or based on other things that might not be relevant for those users? And then third, how do we leverage all the modern design practices that you see in industry when building a government experience? I think we lose sight of that a lot in the government, and we wanted to make sure that we stayed with human-centered design as much as possible. So how do we do that? We do that with business metrics. We use metrics to define success across everything. We say, how can we make a better experience for the users? How can we actually deliver numbers that say we're getting better over time? So the successful login rate, the successful return rate to agencies, all of those are metrics that we use and we track on a day-to-day basis to make sure that we're delivering a great experience for users. I have a little link to a quick site dashboard there. No one here is going to be able to access it, but that gives you an idea. We have a dashboard that we're constantly looking at to make sure that we're getting better over time. And we do the same thing with our DevOps team. Our DevOps team is focused on creating a very stable system that's going to be up through thick and thin. And our availability numbers have shown that we use metrics to track this, and we're doing our best to make sure that we deliver great operational outcomes as well. And then last but not least, customer service. There's a lot of government agencies that have something where they never allow users to give them feedback. They never allow the users to actually get help when they're stuck. We have a customer service center that's up throughout the week. We're not open on weekends, but we're open 12 hours a day, 5 days a week to make sure that we can answer those questions when users get stuck. And we also find out when there's actually problems in our system and where we might not be serving a certain population well enough. The last thing I'm going to cover is what our roadmap looks like over the next coming year. You know, I'm going to talk about some of these things. One thing I will say as a caveat is that things always change, roadmaps always change, new agencies are going to come on, things will be evolved over time, but these are the things that we're going to be working on over the rest of 2018. First, we're launching an LOA 3 pilot in the next month or two. We're overhauling all our account management and improving 2FA. We support 3 2FA methods today. We're adding more of those. And then we're going to move to IAL2 to comply with 863-3 as well. From a customer support perspective, we're implementing all best-in-class CRM tools to allow us to serve customers better, be able to track them better, be able to serve them better over time. On the DevOps side, we're moving to full FedRAMP agency moderate certification. We're also doing a lot of automation around our cloud environment to allow ourselves to have fully automated environments where we can stand up environments top to bottom and not have to have long-lived infrastructure that's sitting there for months on end. So all in all, like this is how we serve customers. I'm not going to spend any more time. I want to give these folks time as well, but happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Joel. It was great. My name is Boysen, and I'm coming to you today. I play 4 different roles in identity, so I'll just touch on those briefly and then talk about the point of view that I'm going to present from today. So I'm Chief Identity Officer at SecureKey in Toronto. We've been involved with a lot of digital transformation projects with government in Canada at the provincial and federal level. I'm also a board member at Cantera, where we're making standards work globally. I'm also a supporter in helping Light Test, which will be the following presentations, giving advice and guidance there. And the role I'm going to talk to you from today is a standards organization in Canada called DIAC, the Digital Identity Authentication Council of Canada. And so, to be clear, I'm not from government, but I have a lot of experience with government, particularly in Canada, about how we want to make digital identity work. The first thing for you to understand is that DIAC does actually have broad support for organizations across Canada. And so all of these organizations have a stake in making digital identity work at scale for consumers across the economy. So you see we have banks, telcos, various levels of government, some technology companies all working together because we're trying to figure out how to make a scheme that'll work for Canada at nation scale. When we look at digital identity, it's not about the identity. Identity in itself is kind of boring and useless. What identity is interesting for is what it does. What it does is allows consumers to be successful in doing the tasks that they would otherwise be kept from doing. There's a huge friction in the economy because consumers can't prove who they are. And so on the one hand, we get consumers getting stuck, and on the other hand, we have businesses that are getting breached and having a hard time managing, making it trustworthy for consumers while at the same time protecting the information. So we're really caught between these two pressures. And so the feeling in Canada is if we can get this story figured out, we can do a bunch of things. One is for sure we want to shut down the sock puppets. That's a prime motivator. We've got to make this safe for business and safe for consumers. So in doing this, we can make this more trustworthy. And in the course of trust, for sure, it's got to be trustworthy from the consumer point of view. Users don't want to get tricked out of their data by over-answering questions and having a surveillance network created, so we certainly don't want that as a country. And it's got to be trustworthy for business, too. They want to make sure the information that's being asserted is the one it belongs to and the information is actually true. And in the course of doing this, we can take costs down, and that's actually been the learning in Canada, actually. The government of Canada went to a federated single sign-on solution that allows Canadians to use their bank account to get the government. And the results have been quite remarkable, actually. The government costs came from $970 million for the period from 2004 to 2012. In the subsequent 6-year period, their costs came down to roughly $200 million. So 80% savings by going to a federated authentication scheme. And then we think we can actually open up the economy. If we can actually take all of this friction out of the economy, we think there's all sorts of new economy opportunities that we can open up. I'm going to show you a couple of demos of what's going on in DIAC, but I just talk about what we've learned already in Canada. What is the experience? The first thing is really, really clear. Users have voted with their passwords. They make them all the same. And so we all want a simpler life. It's clear because that's what the behavior is. And what we have today is do-it-yourself single sign-on. That's what we actually have across the economy. So if consumers want this, and because they're expressing it so clearly in the form of passwords, then we should actually find a way to make it safe for consumers to do that, is the thinking and the learning here in Canada. The second thing is the government of Canada did have that service I just talked about. They had this thing called Secure Channel, which was a PKI scheme for Canadians to reach all their government services across Canada, and it was very expensive to run. The government of Canada's experience, in fact, was it's more expensive to serve people online than it was in person. And so they wanted to go a different route. So they could have done even the next generation of cool technology and kind of done it on a silo again, but they really wanted to take a different path. And I've already shared some of the learnings is that consumers voted very quickly to use something they knew already than rather take yet another user ID and password. In going to procurement, one of the things they did that was clever, and this was Pierre Boucher in the Government of Canada, the Treasury Board, he was very clever in that he didn't over-specify the problem. He didn't make the requirements so tight that the government would wind up overspending on what they were looking for. So he left enough room in the requirements and the procurement documents for Canada that the responders could innovate. And so that's actually what happened in the course. And if I get time, I'll talk about that at the end. The other thing the Government of Canada did, which is remarkable when I compare it to what other governments are doing around the world, is they made by fiat a mandate, the Treasury Board, which is the executive branch of the Canadian government who has authority over all of the money, said all government departments must use the service. And we're going to take a carve out of your budget to make you pay for this service so you can't go off and do your own silly project because you're going to say I'm special. And so by forcing government departments to do that, they were able to stand up and say the Government of Canada will be a customer for this service. And then this is a really kind of an important learning in Canada. The last point is recognition that service delivery is more of a user issue than a tech issue. So what do I mean by that? Let's imagine for a moment that the Government of Canada was able to deploy the exact same user experience and the exact same technology experience that all the banks in Canada use. So from a user point of view, the experience is exactly the same. The learning in Canada is, despite the fact it's the same tech, they are not the same. And this is why. I'm in my bank account every single day. If I can't get in today, I know I didn't forget it because I was just in there. And because I can't get in, I'm on DEFCON fine. I'm terrified. The crooks are in there taking away all my money. Out of self-interest, I will notice quickly and I will do the right thing. So fraud on bank accounts tends to be quite low in Canada. When I compare that to, say, a CRA, our RRS is a CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. I haven't been to CRA for an entire year. When I go there and I can't get in, my assumption is I forgot. And most of the time, that's actually the truth, I forgot. But in the small set of circumstances where there was an account takeover, the crook gets a free ride because the user thinks they forgot. And so the fraud continues. And they don't tell anybody because they just think, oh, I just forgot. And so they solve their problem some other way. This is not a technology issue. This is a user velocity issue. And so the benefit and the learning from the Government of Canada is their business integrity, their business confidence that Andre's gone way up with the service because Andre managed his bank account with self-interest. So it's very unlikely to be fraud. That's been a huge learning for Canada. So everybody's familiar with the parable of the elephant. You've got 6 blind academics. They're walking down a road in India and they encounter an elephant. And what we learn from this parable is that each academic touches a different part of the elephant and thinks that's the whole elephant, whether it's the trunk or the nose or the leg or whatever. And what we're kind of taught from this parable is that each of these players had a partial experience or a partial revelation of what the elephant was all about. And so that's what we're taught that parable is all about. But I think there's a very different learning that we could take away from this parable, which is it took all of them to see the elephant. And so that's the interesting thing, and that's kind of been the experience in Canada, is that when you look at identity schemes across the world, it's very common for each identity player to think they're the center of the universe, they're the one the most important in the consumer's life, and that's where the thing should be centered. And what we've learned in Canada is that there is no center, is that we need all of these players to leverage their strength. And so that's what's happening in Canada is we have a give-to-get network. If you want to participate, you've got to cough something up that will help make the scheme work. And that's kind of what's different than what's happening in Canada. So I'm going to just show you a couple quick examples of what that actually means. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but you'd expect in a standards organizations, we want business, legal, technical to work at scale so everybody knows what the scheme rules are going to be. So we certainly are doing that, and privacy is a key part of that whole story. This innovation experiment based on banks helping consumers reach their government online service has been very successful, and we've taken this to the next stage now, getting beyond authentication and moving to identity too. It was interesting enough that Neil John, which many of you know, said, hey, this thing going on in Canada is kind of cool. We're going to fund a project to prove out this identity service that's launching, and I'm going to show you a very short bit of it because it's part of the storyline I want to show you in a second. We delivered on a white paper at DIAC. We proved out the story as a working proof of concept, and that's been written up and shared, and the materials are available if you want to go read it. Okay, so this is what I actually want to talk about, and this is where government can help. So we did a proof of concept in Canada about 2 years ago at DIAC. It was an idea that I could use a provincial document like a driver's license to open up a bank account on the internet. That proof of concept was delivered and it was very successful. But what we wanted to do is take it a step further. How do we do a trans-border transaction? So this is something we set about. We thought there's lots of new to Canada problems that we need to solve. Opening up a bank account is a great one. If you're going to be a new resident on our country and you want to be part of this modern economy, a bank account is going to be one of the first ingredients you need to be successful in doing that. And so what we wanted to do is figure out how to do that. How do we open a bank account across borders? And so when we look at it from a government point of view, what government can do here is they have the same kind of problem with new to Canada problems. As an immigrant, I have to have a government document that says I have a right to stay and I have a right to work in Canada. So what the government can do here is recognizing the banks basically have the same problem as it relates to regulation and making sure they do a thorough job. What the government can do here is set the regulation menu for safe innovation. Allow the banks the room to move and other players in the economy the room to move to innovate on identity. They will act out of self-interest too. The banks aren't going to do anything that's going to harm their business. They're going to do something very carefully. So let's create the room for this innovation to happen. So the use case I want to talk about is Adam's from the UK, and he wants to come to Canada. He's got a secondment, and so he's going to be in Canada for an extended period. So how do we solve this problem? Well, Adam already has a living footprint in UK. He's got a bank account, and he's got a relationship with the government. And why can't he leverage those assets to begin his new life in Canada for this secondment? And so in order to do this, the setup is we're trying to help Adam with this problem, a new to Canada problem, to get a bank account. So the players in the story are DigIdentity is the IDP in the UK Verify scheme. So Adam's already got a relationship there. And then we want to allow Adam to use that now in Canada to open up a new account with TD Bank. So that's kind of what we're trying to do in this use case. I'm not going to take you through this in detail. These are the regulations for opening up a bank account in Canada. So it has to meet all of these requirements. So if you want to get a photo, you get a photo quick. But I'm not going to go through it because we don't have enough time, and I want to make sure Adam gets time to talk. But everybody's opened a bank account, a set of rules that really do need to be met. Okay. There's a service that's launching this year in Canada called VerifiedMe, and it builds on the authentication service that's out there already. That's called VerifiedMe. And it's a user-centric, privacy-driven solution that allows Canadians to gather together the trusted relationships they have in their life already to get the new things they want in their life, whether it's a bank account, a cell phone, healthcare insurance, or whatever. It's designed to work across the economy. So the way the service works is VerifiedMe is what I call a connector brand. What's a connector brand? It's like Visa. Visa is a connector brand. You don't get Visa from Visa. You got yours from Wells Fargo. I got mine from TD Bank. And each of us can take our Visa card to any merchant on the planet with no prior relationship, and we can get what we want. But when we go to the destination service, the hotel or Starbucks, whatever, you don't see Wells Fargo's logo, you see Visa's logo. So a connector brand says to the consumer, this thing I got from my bank, I can use it over here at the merchant. So VerifiedMe is a connector brand. You don't get it from us. We're just about connecting the endpoints in your life together so you can go get what you want. So VerifiedMe is being used to allow Adam to take his UK asset he's already got in the form of his UK Verify identity scheme and use that to begin his banking process. I'm just going to explain this slide quickly so that we can see how it works in the demo. So on the right are the things that need to be explained to Adam as a user. Now in this example, it's not the UK Verify scheme, it's millennial apartment. So in this example, you're trying to get access to a new apartment. So in this scheme, we need to do two things. We've got to set the context, and then we've got to get consent. So the context is making really clear to the user who's going to get the data. Who's the destination service? And this is also to solve the man-in-the-middle problem, to make sure the user didn't inadvertently get tricked out of their data. So it's really clear to the user who's going to get the data. And then on the bottom, because we're getting an apartment in this scenario, there's lots of data that are required to get access to an apartment. You've got to have a proven connection to a bank account. They want to get a credit profile, government-issued photo ID, and they want to have connection to your mobile number. If you're curious, you can click on those things. You can see maybe in On the words on the slide, it says you can review, so you can see exactly what data is going to be shared. So we're setting a context and then gathering consent. So if you're good to share, you click on the button and the registration happens. So this is being used to connect the UK Verify scheme to TD Bank so that Adam can open up his bank account. Adam's going to talk at length about UK Verify in a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but it's a scheme in UK where providers that are in UK allow UK residents or UK citizens to access government services online there. So we've got 2 trust schemes in 2 different countries now participating in this scheme. TD Bank is a large bank in Canada. It's one of the big 2. TD Bank has several new to Canada scenarios that they need to service. That's their interest in this particular case. They also recognize that they have a role to play in helping consumers prove their identity elsewhere. So in some cases, they'll be consuming data from other parties, which is true in this scenario. In other cases, they'll be helping TD customers go to other places with their TD information to access other services that they want. So here's the demo. I'm going to show you 2 demos. I'm just going to explain them so that we can see. So the first one is the registration, where Adam's going to take his UK Verify credentials and use that to create a credential in Canada so he can participate in the scheme. Having done the credential creation in our service, he can then go open a bank account. So let's walk through the registration flow. So what we're going to do is begin with the VerifiedMe service, and we're going to log in with the UK Verify and DigIdentity. So it goes by selecting your IDP, UK Verify. You do a redirect over to the IDP, in this case, DigIdentity. This is the DigIdentity authentication flow. So it requires an email password, and then there's a second factor authentication flow that goes with it. At the end of this process, DigIdentity says, hey, you're going to share your scheme with a third party here in SecureKey. And so we're going to basically, you have to agree to let your information leave the UK Verify program because you're crossing scheme boundaries. So that's what this screen is all about, is you're leaving UK Verify. And then when you arrive in our scheme, which is VerifiedMe, we've got to gather consent as well. So there's consents twice because you're crossing borders. And once you've done that, Adam is now enrolled in the VerifiedMe service. So he has a digital asset that allows him to participate on par with the assets he has inside the scheme. So now, if he wants to open a bank account, he goes to TD Bank and say, hey, I want a bank account. And they're going to say, well, if you want to, you can enroll with VerifiedMe. And what it says is UK Verify is going to share some data, and this is exactly what data is going to get shared. If you're okay to consent to share, you can say agree, put your finger on Touch ID to demonstrate consent, and boom, your bank account's been opened. So that's kind of an example of how we can make these schemes kind of work across borders and at scale. I've got one more quick slide, and then I want to get it on to Adam. So what did we learn in this? So conceptually, this is very doable. Like, this is a very surmountable problem. There are some regulations hurdles we've got to get over, however. The FinTrack regulations, which is our AML statutes in Canada, don't allow for digital identity. They don't preclude it, but don't explicitly allow it. And so the challenge with that is the regulators and the compliance folks in the banks are quite risk averse, and so we've been kind of stuck on can we do it or not? And so we're asking for clear guidance here about enabling this kind of thing to happen. And so that's the first thing, and then the next step is actually figuring out how to weave this into a proper flow. We put this together as a proof of concept, not as a way we'd actually roll it out in production. So some of the flows that you saw there were like we're doing double consented as examples, something we wouldn't do in a real scheme. Anyway, so that's my bit, and I'm going to save questions at the end so that Adam gets enough time to talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Andre. Ooh, do I get some slides? Hello, magic happened. You killed it. Well done. Okay, so I'll start talking anyway. Oh no, it's here, it's here. Okay, that's a good place to start, do no harm. So I'm Adam Cooper. Until a couple of months ago, I was with the UK government. I've now left, so full disclosure. But I spent roughly 9 years working on identity in the UK government. And I'm going to try and compress into the next 9 minutes what we learned in that period of time. And it was a very interesting journey. We started with a blank sheet of paper, None of the things we have now in Gov UK Verify existed. We didn't have the legal elements, we didn't have the scheme, we didn't have identity providers. There was nothing. There were no standards. We created them all along the way. And it's been a really interesting journey that's helped us to understand how we can do no harm. And that's a big theme of what governments, I believe, should be involved in, is doing no harm. This isn't about helping us with efficiencies in government. This isn't about us trying to snoop into people's lives. I mean, we tried to create an identity card scheme in the UK a few years back, and that didn't work out very well. There was a huge amount of uproar in the people. It's something that just will never work in the UK. We don't have single identifiers for individuals either. We have multiple identifiers. So there is a whole patchwork of things going on in the UK, and a very strong privacy lobby, and a great will within government to support that as well. So doing no harm is very important. I also come from a health background, and this is a phrase that we use all the time in the health service. It's do no harm to the patient before you move on and care for them. So what do we actually learn in Gov UK Verify? And as I say, I've been on this journey for many years, but we've learned a lot of things, and it seemed like a whirlwind at the time. And the first thing is to set some ground rules. And I mentioned that it's very important that we do no harm. It's also very important that we observe all the things that we need to do for users. And one of the first things we did, and one of the most important things we did in Gov UK Verify, was we created an external group to advise us, a privacy consumer advisory group that had academics within it, had experts in identity within it, had people who cared deeply about people's rights within it. And they advised us and helped us set principles for how we were going to build this identity system called Verify. And I think that's a basic learning that everybody who in government who's trying to build an identity system should observe. It's not just about looking at creating a new welfare system. It's about saving money for the government. It's about actually helping your citizens. And that was a key thing that we built in from the beginning. Because we need to focus on making lives better. This is what it really is about. And the catalyst for Verify itself was a thing called Universal Credit in the UK, which has cross-party support and has many ups and downs in the press, but at its heart is designed on bringing together all of the benefits and services that we provide to citizens in the UK and providing them as a single benefit to individuals, to stop all of the confusion, to speed up the process so that we can get to the most needy more quickly. And that was an important catalyst, because to do that more effectively, we actually need identity. If we want to give people the best healthcare, it's great if we can understand more quickly who they are and where they are and what their needs are, because we can deliver things to them digitally then, and we can speed the system along. Systems that are largely paper-based, or certainly were for a lot of that time. The other thing we had to get over is we had to really break the way procurement worked in the UK. When we started doing this, it was all about monolithic procurements. One of the first things I did when I joined Government Digital Service, which is where a lot of this work sat, was to take a £220 million procurement that the Department for Work and Pensions, who were behind the Universal Credit, were going out to tender for. And we stopped it at the 11th hour. Why? Because what we didn't want to do was go and procure one provider for 10 years to give us something that at the end of that time would be out of date, not fit for purpose, and will have cost us a lot of money. We cut that down to a £22 million procurement. And that procurement created a framework of providers that had the skills necessary to build identity systems. And we drew down from that for what we wanted to do at a particular time, so we could move at pace and without making massive investments up front. And that actually caused us to change how the Crown Procurement Service works in the UK. So that was a big win. And it's worth challenging these things in government. The other thing that's been very important is being transparent. We talk about everything we do. We were invited, for example, to the US by the US government about 3 or 4 years ago for the genesis of what became the work that Joel's been working on login.gov, to give our experience, to be open, to share. We blog about everything we do. We publish everything we do. It's very important that we share our experiences and our wins and the things that go wrong and be honest about it. And that's difficult sometimes in government. it's also very important to fight the good fight in government. And what I mean by that is that there is a lot of politics within government as well as without. There's probably more politicians working as civil servants in the UK than there are actually sitting in the Houses of Parliament. Fact. There are many fiefdoms. There are many people who are building their own little empires, and that's just the way government works, I'm afraid, certainly in the UK. And it's been very important that we've fought hard and taken the knocks, and we've had lots of bad press, and we've had lots of people briefing against us, but you have to pick yourself up and move on and keep going and fight for what you believe in, and that's very important, not just give in. So what can we actually do better as governments? So I mentioned how we should be very user-focused and do no harm, but we should actually provide extra services to users. We should protect them. One of the things that nobody really talks about is what happens when things go wrong. If my identity is compromised, how can I repair that? Where are the services for identity repair? Where are the functions to do that? And I think that's something that governments can play a very major role in making happen. How do you pick up the pieces when my identity's been compromised and all these transactions with banks and governments and all kinds of things have fraudulently happened? How do I fix that? It's very hard. We should also provide other services to users as well to make sure that they can have portable identities. So don't tie them into, yes, we've created Gov UK, but as you've just seen with Andre, we should be able to be interoperable and allow our identities to be used externally and other schemes. I mean, not just cross-border, absolutely cross-border, but from scheme to scheme as well. So don't lock it down to one thing. We should definitely encourage innovation. Governments are very well placed to do this. If we can create the right environments and the right ingredients for innovation to happen by supporting different technologies, allowing them to be tested and piloted within government and not lock people out by having procurements that say we will only deal with certain suppliers, but actually open it up to a whole group of people and encourage them to work, that's a very important thing we can do. And anything we can do as well from our internal teams and giving our experience to that, more the better. I certainly spent a lot of time when I was in government and still do working with standards bodies and groups working on identity internationally because it's very good that we spread the word and experience and learn from other people and help them learn from us. As I say, we have to champion standards. This is something that governments can do really well. We're good at bringing in things like standardization and working in those groups to make sure that people have something they can actually connect trust to. We need to understand how these things work. And we have to make sure others benefit, and by others I mean not just the public sector, so other governments, as I mentioned, US Digital, but also the private sector. We shouldn't be worried about working with private sector organizations to help them progress as well. It's almost natural sometimes for governments to be very closed to the private sector and not want to share. And quite often, GDS, Government Digital Service, has got that wrong in the UK, and that's something we need to focus on. Because the most important thing is we need to do no harm. But what we actually need to do is do some good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So now we're going to move to the panel portion, where we actually get to talk and have some interaction between everybody. I'm going to suggest the three of you guys move up to the edge if it's not too scary, being at the precipice. That way everybody over here can see you, and you're not behind the podium. So we've actually got almost a half an hour, actually. One thing I realized was we were supposed to take a 5-minute break between when I spoke and when we started the panel, and we just flowed right in, which gives us extra things to talk about. So I had a couple questions just to tee things up, and then I really want to take some time to throw it open to the audience. One of the things that stood out, I think, looking at not just your presentations, but keynotes we've seen, and as well as the keynote we had yesterday from the former CIO of Estonia, is the topic of scale. And one of the things that stands out to me, so Google does identity at scale, Microsoft does identity at scale. Estonia is a country of 1.3 million people. They've done some amazing things, but it's a different issue of scale. So Canada has, what, about 30 million people? How many in the UK? How many? About 70 million. We're about 330 million in the US. Doing something in bigger countries at scale tends to take, from my perspective, a couple things. One, resources, namely money, to actually be able to build something that can scale. And second, executive support in government to make sure that, given how complicated bigger governments can be, given the bureaucracies, given the different fiefdoms that are out there, the ability to try and drive a government-wide solution forward. And I wondered if each of you could provide some perspectives in terms of the support that you've gotten in terms of both resources and executive support in each country as these programs have developed. So one microphone, who grabs it first?
So I can talk a little bit about how we did it in login.gov. So we knew right from the beginning, from that initial discovery meeting, and thank you again for helping launch us, we couldn't have done what we did without standing on the shoulders of the UK. They definitely gave us a lot of learnings. What we learned really quickly is that LOA 3 is hard. Identity proofing is hard. There's a lot of edge cases. There's a lot of things that aren't going to go the way you think they're going to go. And so we took that in and we said, okay, we're going to start working on this up front, but we're actually going to roll out an LOA 1 solution first to help us with the scale question. So Jeremy, you said, how did you scale? What we did is we rolled out LOA 1 first, and then we started to get all of our technical people with that high scale, with big use cases. We're up to about 6.3 million users today, and we're actually handling that load because we've learned our way into it. Now, when we roll out LOA 3 in the coming months, then we actually take that and we already have the technical scale that we need. Now we start layering on the really difficult problems of LOA 3 and the difficult edge cases of where people are going to fail. So that will be a different level of scale, a different level of problems. But we started with the easy stuff first, scaled that first, and then now we're moving up to the harder stuff.
Just to add to that from what we did in the UK, I mean, one of the mistakes Gov UK Verify actually made at the beginning was scoping itself down to level 2, so LOA 2, which is not as hard as level 3, but is pretty hard for somebody to get. And there was reasoning behind that at the time, that the certain transactions that were connected to Verify early on were very central government type transactions. So they actually thought they needed, when I say thought, because at the time they thought that's what they needed, was this really strong proof of identity. The reality is that makes it quite hard for people to transact with you. And what they really needed, and they've learnt, and they've actually learnt this over time, is that the LOA 1 situation is actually far more useful in the majority of cases, because it allows people to start that process of what they want to do most of the time, which is just start an application, just get into the system. And once they're in the system, we can help them. And that message has really hit home. So now we've learned that lesson, and Joel got it right from day one, is that you have to give people the ability to get into the system, to get that identity. And if they need to do something else later, then fine, build on that, but get them in first. And that's really important. The other thing that we did to help with scale right from the very beginning is that we didn't have one provider. We've got 7 in the UK. So, and we opened it out to, I mentioned the framework of procurement that we had before, the style. It enabled us to have multiple identity providers. And that gives us quite an edge, really, because we've worked out now that to actually prove your identity in the UK, there's around about 50,000 different routes you can take through those different providers, because of all the different data sources and methods of proof that you can use to prove who you are. And that's fantastic, because from a coverage point of view, that allows us to get to the most needy people in society, which are the ones we certainly want to help. But it also makes it easier for people to get an identity, because you don't even have to rely on a government-issued document anymore, because of the different methods we had.
One of the things that I'm particularly interested in, I think that if we want to be successful in identity, we've got to figure out how to make it work at global scale. And the challenge, when I look at many of the schemes around the world, is they tend to be very parochial. They're trying to solve it at a national scale. And so I give a lot of credit to what Estonia has done as well, but the challenge with the Estonia scheme is it won't work elsewhere. If If you try to roll out a national identity scheme in UK or Canada, or particularly here in the US, it's like a political hot potato, and it'll just never go anywhere. And so one of the learnings in identity, I think, and this is what this community has kind of taught me, is that identity is culture everywhere you go to. There's going to be a slightly different tweak on how identity has to work in country. Having said that, I want to go back to your comment, Jeremy, which is, we can look to the social media giants for guidance on having large-scale identity schemes, and if, for sure, if the countries at the country level don't get their stuff together, that's the default answer, is what we will get at global scale will be social media. However, I would challenge you that the biggest identity scheme in the world is not Apple, Facebook, and Google and those guys. It's actually the credit card networks. We've got 6 billion credit cards in circulation around the globe that all have your name printed on the surface. And when you go to the hotel, they use your credit card, which has your name on it, in addition to your passport or driver's license, to let you in. The biggest global identity scheme we actually have is the credit card scheme. And so that's where we should be learning from. So what's interesting about the global payment scheme is they don't do what we do on the internet. The internet, we have man-in-the-middle attacks all day long, every service, like it's nonstop. There's more man-in-the-middle than there is real transactions. And so we don't have this problem in the credit card scheme. We don't get the message from the local, your Visa company saying, hey, don't go to the local Starbucks. They had a breach last week, and that they don't trust the terminal. We don't see those messages. Why is that? So what the global payment system done is this. The first thing is they've hidden all the complexity away from the user, and they stuck it in the card. As a user, I have to understand nothing about how the credit card works in order to be successful in the scheme. And more importantly than hiding the complexity from the user, we've made a really simple user ritual. All I have to know is how to tap my card. And so the user sophistication for credit card schemes is quite low. And when you compare that to the internet, where the expectation of user sophistication is quite high, we can see why the problems are so prevalent on the internet. So that's the first thing, we hid complexity. The second thing we've done in the global payments system is this. We put a trusted network operator in the middle, so a crook can't pop in the middle and say, hey, I'm a crook, I take Visa, right? You have to apply to get into the network, and you have to behave well to stay in the network. So we don't see these man-in-the-middle attacks in the credit card scheme. The third most important thing that keeps the global payment system safe is user behavior. I will tell Wells Fargo 15 seconds after I lost my card, and I'll do that not because I promised them I would. I don't care about Wells Fargo. I care about me. I'm terrified the crook who found that thing is going to run up my bill, and I'm going to be responsible. I will notice quickly and do the right thing out of self-interest, because that's what I want to do to make sure that I don't have to pay a bigger bill. That's what keeps the global payment system safe. 6 billion cards in circulation, no man-in-the-middle attacks. We need to figure out how to do that for identity. So what's cool about the credit card scheme is, first, it works at global scale. 2, there is some mechanism to tailor it to some level by country. We use national standards and a standard user ritual for all of these schemes as well. Like all the payment brands, Visa, Amex, MasterCard, Discover, all of them use the same form factor, the same technology, and the same user ritual, and the same merchant acceptance principles. So there's universal acceptance. That's global identity. We got to do that for global identity. And that's the point of view that we've taken in Canada for sure. And it's a thrust we're pioneering at SecureKey, is how do we create a strong identity scheme. So here's the last thought around this. The problem we have today is that when we do a registration online, because we're using all these crazy methods, it's very difficult to tell the difference between the real user and the crook. Actually, it's worse than that. Usually the crook is more convincing than the real user, right? I'm Andre Boysen, and I can't pass the Andre Boysen test. This is how crazy this model is of doing KBA. And so what I would argue is that the entire identity scheme that we do for everything today, even driver's licenses in person, is all card not present. It's crazy, right? In the credit card scheme, when I present my card to the terminal, the risk of fraud is almost 0. But when we go on the internet and we buy stuff, we're all typing stuff into browsers, and every merchant on the planet is running like their alert detectors trying to figure out, is that Andre or a crook, right? That's called card not present. Card not present is very high risk, and there's a whole level of regimen that's applied to that's not applied to the online scheme. If we can get to card present identity, all of these problems will go away. The sock puppets are dead, all right? So we're going to do that in Canada by creating chip and pin for identity. The chip in this chip and pin model is going to be the mobile phone, which, like credit cards, runs at global scale. The pin in this chip and pin model is going to be the password on your bank account. And I can bring in my government-issued ID, and I can prove I'm a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. Let users gather together their own identity the same way they do in the real world. Sorry, that was long, but that's what's happening in Canada.
Go back on the original side, was talking about resources. I thought one of the most interesting facts that came out as the three of you were speaking was that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has funded Canada with $800,000. You getting any money from DHS, Joel? I have a follow-up on this, sorry.
I mean, I have plenty of money. Money is not my problem. I do have to make sure that I'm spending the money responsibly, so don't take that the wrong way. But at the end of the day, like, money is never our problem when we're trying to do this. Usually the problems that we run into are bureaucracy, not having enough physical people to build the software, and being able to procure things quickly enough. So in government, it's just a really weird place. I come from private industry, and I will tell you, this is the weirdest job I've ever had, because money is not a limitation. It's just the ability to physically get people in to actually do the work necessary.
Focus in on allocation of resources. So it sounds like you've got a dedicated funding stream. There's other models that are relying more on investment by industry, and I wondered if each of you could talk a little bit about how you're getting resources from on the financial side to build and deliver identity at scale.
Yeah, mine's pretty simple and pretty quick. We have a multi-pronged approach that we talked about on Monday, which is we have 30 feds that are building this. We augment that with contractors, a lot from small businesses. We want to award small businesses as much as possible. And third, we depend on a lot of software from industry players who are amazing. So all of the amazing software packages, many of the companies that you see here this week are ones that are helping us deliver on the outcome that we need to deliver. And from a funding perspective, you know, we built a financial model that says, here's what you would need to do in order to build a successful login system and to build a successful identity system. And if you look at the cost of it, you know, to your earlier point, Andre, is much cheaper to build it centrally than it is for each and every agency to build it as they do today. So, you know, the numbers just tended to make sense.
Okay, so from the UK perspective, we have something called Government Digital Service in the UK, which was created some years ago now, about just over 5 years ago, I think now, within our Cabinet Office. And it's funded centrally. It's funded from money from Treasury. And there's a model now where funding is also coming from other departments as well for their use of identity. But why it was originally set up was not to create an identity scheme that forever the government would own and maintain. We set up Gov UK Verify, as it's now called, the identity assurance program it was originally, was to actually create the catalyst for identity in the UK. So it was funded to create the environment in which private sector identity providers, and all of our identity providers are private sector organizations, could create the services and the environment, but with some of the work we were doing about creating standards, to create this environment and ecosystem in the UK that we could build upon as UK PLC, if you like. That was the original vision. There have been some problems with that over the years. It hasn't quite got to that ideal world yet. And there's a bit of a decision point at the moment about how we deal with that, which I'm trying to be part of that solution. And I've got confidence that we can make that happen and make sure that that original vision of seeding that ecosystem works and is successful. At which point, largely, the UK government becomes consumer. At which point, I could see the resource in UK government that's been involved in building this ecosystem and running this ecosystem diminishing. And I think that's the way it should be. Government should become consumer of identity. We did it for a reason to start with, to kickstart the whole process. It's time to let go.
I think another kind of learning, it's obvious, but as obvious as what I'm about to say is, nobody actually acts as if it's true. And that the challenge is that nobody buys an ecosystem. And so when we run around saying ecosystem, 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 nobody gives a shit about the ecosystem. What people care about is their own business. And so what we've been trying to do is figure out how to appeal to self-interest of all the participants who are going to be in the scheme. And so that's been a successful strategy. Rather than trying to run around with a pot and get this thing pre-funded, instead of that, we're appealing to self-interest in each of the participants. And so I'm going to do a little bit on trust frameworks and just talk about Canada for a second. So when it comes to trust frameworks, there's at least 3 different kinds. The most common trust framework we're all familiar with is the payment schemes, right? So that's what I would call a asymmetric framework. You have issuers on one side and acceptors on the other. So banks all issue and merchants all accept. All the transactions go one way. So that's an asymmetric scheme. Then you also have a symmetric scheme, which is more like stockbrokers and real estate agents That's a symmetric scheme, because one day I could be the buyer and the next day I could be the seller. And then the third kind is what we're doing in Canada, is what's hybrid, where everybody accepts and only some people issue. Now, in the first scheme, it's very hard to get the balance right, because the banks own the risk and the merchants want to know they're going to get paid. And so trying to balance the forces in an asymmetric scheme is actually quite hard. And in a symmetric scheme, where you're going to be a buyer one day and a seller the next, balancing the rules or the forces, the rules, is actually a lot easier, because people recognize, like, okay, I maybe have a risk over here, but I'll have a compensating risk when I'm on the other side. And what we have in Canada is this hybrid scheme where, banks, as an example, will always be wanting to consume data. In some cases, they'll provide. Governments, too, in some cases, they'll want to issue data. In other cases, they're going to want to provide, and so too with telcos. But then we'll get other players. I'm making this up a little bit, but examples are like healthcare, maybe in insurance, where they're only going to consume data. They'll never provide data. Okay, so now I want to get back to the self-interest point. So we've got providers of data and we've got consumers of data. On the consumer side, the economics of this are quite clear. Today, we don't do any high assurance services on the internet because we can't prove it's really you. So for high assurance things like bank accounts, cell phones, government-issued stuff, healthcare, we force you to account for the first time, and then we give you user ID and password. So we force counter visits. Counter visits typically take half hour to 45 minutes to examine your documents and fill out the forms and send you away with a password. So that costs in the order of 50 to 75 bucks. If we can do this digitally now, we can actually improve on the integrity of the information that's being shared, do it with less data, and we can take the cost from 75 bucks down to $2 or $3. Rioting parties want this because they're going to take their cost down by an order of magnitude. They can improve the customer experience, offer better privacy, reduce their breach risk, and get their cost down too. And so that's self-interest. And so on the provider side, well, how do we get the providers to participate in the scheme? Like banks as an example. Why on earth would the banks do this? Well, one is that they recognize that they've got their own commercial challenges, which is lots of competitors, but so they've got to find new ways to serve. But there's also, they'll get paid. When I choose to share my data from TD to a third party, today when I share my paper statement, they get nothing. And I don't tell them, and they get nothing. But in this model, they'll get paid something, and then me, the consumer, am able to control the transaction, and so they get paid. And so that's self-interest. And so that's kind of how we make this whole thing work in Canada, is by appealing to the self-interest of the players.
Thanks. So I've got more questions, but we've got about 11 minutes left. I'd love to throw things open to the audience if anybody has questions that they'd like to ask. Really? You're going to let me just keep asking all of them?
I can probably speak loud enough. So I heard that. So I heard Joel talk about how he had how login.gov had learned a little bit off Gov UK Verify, and well, we didn't hear that exact thing with SecureKey in Canada, but we know where Canada got its standards from, so we don't need to go there. So the question I have, I guess, is, has it been a case of improving every time? Do all three of you feel that you've made it better than the thing that you built off before? That, when you stood on the shoulders, is it better now than the thing that you were using as your base? So I'd just like to hear about that, and whether it's actually gone better or it's flat, it's leveled out.
Thank you, Colin. I actually think it has got better. Having lived the journey for so many years with Gov UK Verify, I've seen the ups and downs just within Verify itself of how we've learned from what we've done, and it's made a lot of mistakes along the way. When you start with a blank sheet of paper and you're kind of making it up as you go along and learning and building things and trying to do that at scale for a whole nation, it's kind of tricky sometimes, and you make mistakes, and we've learned. Things like going down the wrong route for levels of assurance. Absolutely, that was the wrong decision. There have been other things around the types of transactions that we've brought into the Verify system have not been compelling enough, so it hasn't driven uptake by users, for example, because we don't mandate that identity. So you don't have to get one in the UK. It's not like the German system where everybody has one. So things like that have been problems along the way, and we've learned. And it's been really useful for us and cathartic in many ways, to talk to our friends in the US and Canada and other places as well, and sort of say, well, we did this thing, and if we did it again, we probably wouldn't do that. So yeah, learn from that. And then you get things like login.gov, where Joel's picked that up and his team, and I think have done a fantastic job and did the right thing, started with the right level of assurance, and started small and didn't try and boil the ocean. And I think he's built a good platform there, and I'm hoping, I've got high hopes that that'll be something that goes forward. I'm really quite interested in what's happening in Canada, because it's a different model to what we've done entirely, but it's kind of taking some of the things that we've done as well a little bit. It's great that we're doing collaborations on interoperability. That's fantastic as well, because one of the things we haven't really talked about enabling us to do things at scale is we need some portability of identity. I mean, somebody mentioned before about, I think it was Jeremy, that every different nation does, and it might be you actually, Andrew, every different nation does identity differently. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something in Europe that we recognize very early on. So the EIDAS regulation that Jeremy mentioned earlier actually recognizes that there's never going to be harmonization in these schemes. They are deliberately different for reasons only special to those nations. And we have to respect that. But at the same time, we have to somehow communicate the trust from one to the other. And that's where EIDAS came into play, and it introduced laws and things like that around identity. But it also introduced lots of really simple ways of passing that trust from across one border to another. And we can learn from that as well. I mean, I was heavily involved in that, but I think we should learn from that as well. It's not just crossing borders, it's crossing schemes in identity. So within a nation, you should be able to do exactly the same. So you could have multiple schemes. And then all of a sudden, when we think about some of the things that Andre was talking about, where you can have a UK Verify identity and then take that trust and then use it somewhere else entirely. From a user's point of view, that's really powerful, because I don't have to create lots of different identity accounts throughout the world. That really does help me do things at scale, because I should just be able to go anywhere and use the same thing that I've already got. Why do I have to prove it again? So that really helps in the scale thing. So all these things we've learned along the way, and I think it's been really important that the UK government put the effort in early on to make the mistakes and build on that and share, so that we ourselves hopefully will benefit in the long run.
Why don't you go next?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say there other than I think it is much better so far, but the jury's still out, right? Like, we haven't rolled out LOA 3, and once we roll that out, if we are able to get a much larger than we've done in the past. We also learned, I must say, we've had prior failures in the US government as well, and we learned from those a lot. And we took a very different approach to budget and policy and everything else based on those learnings as well. So yeah, I would say overall the initial signs are good, but there's still a ways to go.
We had some participation in the scheme here in the US called Connect.gov. And there was interest in what was happening with banks in Canada with the service there. And so Connect.gov got launched up because there was some interest in copying the model, but there were some differences. And we learned from those differences. I'm not going to touch on all of them. I'll just focus and keep it to the government point. One of the challenges is that, in Canada we have an authentication hub. And so we invented this concept of triple blind privacy in Canada because we were concerned that connecting all of these services together could be dangerous. And so in Canada, the authentication model says that when you have a bank account and you get to government, the bank doesn't get to see your online destination. They don't know when to tax or health or whatever. The government in its place doesn't know what bank you came from, but they know you came from a Tier 1 bank in Canada. And our company, which operates the service, we don't know who you are. So triple blind privacy said, not the bank, not the government, not SecureKey, got a complete version, sorry, a complete visibility to the user transaction. As we launched Connect.gov with Post Office, they couldn't do authentication only because the scale was so much bigger. They said, look, I love the authentication scheme, but I need identity too. And so we helped them launch a scheme that did identity and authentication together. And there was a privacy researcher, I forget his last name, Luis Di Fernando, I think his last name is, but he's a privacy researcher. And he wrote a privacy paper that kind of said, on mending two nation scale identity schemes. And he was talking about verifying and connect. And his criticism was of these broker schemes. And he says, look, if you had an honest but curious broker, they could peak. That's what he said in the paper. And what he was trying to say is if the NSA wanted to, they could scoop up all the data. And so they were very, very critical of having a broker model. And we learned from that. It was like, okay, we know how to do triple blind authentication, but if we're going to do identity, no party should have visibility to the whole transaction, because you're going to have these problems of too much stuff, either somebody trying to monetize the data or privacy breaches or surveillance. So how do we do triple blind identity? So that was the learning for us, Colin, is how do we figure out how to do triple blind identity so I can share my data from A to B without anybody getting complete visibility. So that was something we worked really hard on to solve, is to make sure we could do identity without becoming a honeypot.
Question in front. Let me actually bring the microphone down so we can hear her.
It's a question for probably the non-UK Verify. Verify has actually used a model where it uses private sector partners. As Adam says, it's starting an ecosystem. The government's not going to own this long term. Do you see your schemes evolving in the same way? And what does that mean to interoperability? Because if you look at the number of companies around the world that could start to operate in the same space in each of these countries. So do you see your schemes evolving in that way, or will they always be a government central scheme?
Yeah, for the US specifically, if you go back to privacy, security, and usability, we thought a lot about this question, and this was like the first 3 months of our program. We thought very carefully about how we wanted to do this. We did consider that approach, and it fell down a lot on usability, to be honest with you. Like, it was great with security and it was great with privacy, but it was pretty bad from a usability perspective because the users forget where they had their account from. That's just what the users do. We did a ton of research with hundreds of users and basically said, like, do you get this? Like, does this make sense to you? And the users just didn't. So yes, it's possible that we will do it, but it will be user driven. And a lot of the feedback that I've given on the various identity policy papers have been around make sure that whatever you're doing is user driven, not policy driven that's blind to what the users want. So if the users demand it, then yes, absolutely, we will do something like that, but it has to come from the users. That absolutely would not stop us at all, and I would go back to users and say, do I have users demanding that we should accept that as a credential? And if so, absolutely, we should support it.
I guess my own sense is we don't want any IDP. Like, that's not the right model here. That's not any company. It's not the kind of concept here. It's got to be organizations that have an existing trusted relationship with the consumer, and it's a relationship the consumer cares about. And it's anchored in this concept we call motivation to recover. Users will do the right thing out of self-interest. And as you look across the user life, the average user today has 130 user IDs and passwords. We don't treat those all with equal care. We got the ones we really care about, the ones we been once and never been back again. And so what we're advocating for is, back to the cultural point, is in Canada we've got a bank-led scheme because that made sense for us. We may find in other countries like Estonia and other countries in Europe and maybe even South America where they have central identity schemes by government, that a government-led scheme makes more sense. And we may find in other countries yet again that maybe having a telco-led scheme makes the most sense, like in Brazil where you have a lot of people who are unbanked, or maybe even UK where it might be easier to get the telcos to cooperate than the banks. So that's just commentary, but the point is that those are the three providers that matter the most to the consumer: bank, telco, government, and it overlays against every country. The choice is at the national level is who they choose to lead, but you need all three to be successful in my view. And so, yeah, we need a scheme that allows countries to make the choices that make sense for them.
Just to wrap that out slightly, I totally agree that whatever happens has to be user-led. You can't force individuals to go down a particular route. I mean, we know that very much so in the UK. We've spent a lot of time working on that. What I would say is, though, that getting back to the UK model again, one of the other mistakes it made was trying to brand things Gov UK Verify. Because what it actually did was, because you have 7 providers, it changed the perception of the user to think that they were getting a Gov UK Verify credential. The reality was they were actually getting a credential from one of the 7 providers. So the real relationship they had was with the post office or with Barclays Bank or whoever it might be, who was one of those providers. And if we'd have done more on that, and one of the first things we did was, when we first thought about creating the system, was we actually didn't have a Gov UK Verify brand. It's before we even thought that up. What we actually did was just let the user choose. And they went to, oh, I'll have the post office because I like that, I trust that brand. And you build that relationship with that provider. Now, in that case, it's user-led. I mean, then they don't forget who they've got the relationship with. We've kind of made the mistake of muddying those waters by trying to have this Gov UK Verify brand across the top. And that's kind of hurt us, because then we do get the problems, as Joel was saying, where the user gets a bit confused and, oh, did I create it with Post Office, or was it Royal Mail, or I can't remember. So yeah, sorry, I'm being told
I'm getting the red blinky thing at me, which means we're now over time. So I'm glad I took that 5-minute break from you at the beginning. We got more questions. Thank you, Joel, Adam, Andre, all for coming. Thanks for all of you. And we'll be back in 5 minutes where Don Thibault will be taking over for the second half of the session. Thank you.